I'm Donna Rivera, the Associate Director of Pharmacoepidemiology at the FDA Oncology Center of Excellence and a member of the CCC19 Scientific Executive Committee. So thank you so much for that excellent keynote, Dr. Pergam, really emphasizing the need for more data to help us in understanding this disease better. I think it is our world has just fundamentally changed, and we've endured so much over the past year. And likewise, it's remarkable to see how far scientific discoveries have come in that same time to give us renewed hope. As I was reflecting on the first call with a small group of us last March, amid a lot of uncertainty and unknowns, personally and professionally, we had a shared understanding among the committee of this need of a moral imperative to help. We had to do something, and CCC19 was formed. This consortium has become an incredible example of what is possible during a time of limited evidence and high public health need, of the collaborative potential of team science, of clinicians, epidemiologists, statisticians with a shared and simple research goal of helping patients. The scientific community has worked tirelessly to quickly learn about this disease, and clearly we're still learning, and especially to those on the front line to which our gratitude cannot be quantified. All of these efforts collectively inspire us and highlight the power of coming together toward a shared objective. I am grateful to work alongside this thoughtful, compassionate, and dedicated group of collaborators. This next panel is going to focus on registry data for patients with COVID and cancer, discussing how registries were able each to rapidly respond, prioritize key questions to answer, and about what questions we still need to answer, and the potential for additional collaboration in the use of real-world data for evidence generation. With that, it is my absolute honor as a federal employee to introduce Dr. Andrew Von Eschenbach. Dr. Von Eschenbach is currently the president of Samaritan Health Initiatives. He is also an adjunct professor at MD Anderson Cancer Center, where he previously spent 26 years as a urological oncologist before serving as the director of the National Cancer Institute and commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. At the FDA, he championed modernization through process improvement of the regulatory pathway for drugs and medical devices, and by fostering creative projects that included the Critical Path Initiative. Under his leadership, the FDA experienced dramatic increases in resources, enabling implementation of many new programs designed to strengthen the FDA in its mission to protect and promote public health, which is more important than ever right now. He is also on the board of the Reagan-Udall Foundation and has engaged in the Evidence Accelerator effort, utilizing real-world evidence to address the challenges of COVID-19. Please welcome Dr. Von Eschenbach and the next panel.
Thank you, Don, and thank you very much for all the hard work that you're doing at the FDA to advance the use of real-world evidence. And I want to thank all of you for joining us for this very timely and very important discussion. We're in the midst now of a really amazing opportunity to answer many of the questions that I think Dr. Bergman presented so well. And we're very, very fortunate to have with us today an outstanding group of authorities in oncology who have really been at the forefront of gathering the kind of real-world experience that we need to understand these issues. Dr. Elizabeth Garrett-Mayer, representing ASCO COVID-19 Registry. Dr. Meyer is the Division Director for Biostatistics and Research Data and Governance at the Center for Research and Analytics of the American Society of Clinical Oncology. Prior to that, she was the Director of Biostatistics at the Hollings Cancer Center and Professor of Biostatistics at the Medical University of South Carolina. Dr. Gilberto de Lima Lopes is representing the COVID Cancer Consortium 19 registry. He's the interim chief of the Division of Medical Oncology at the Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center at the University of Miami, and is also the medical director for the international programs and associate director for global oncology. Dr. Solange Peters, representing ESMO Co-Care Registry. She's the head of medical oncology at the Central Hospital in Vaduz at Lausanne, Switzerland, and is president of the European Society for Medical Oncology. Dr. Jennifer Whisenant, representing the Thoracic Cancers International COVID-19 Collaboration, She's a research assistant professor at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to tell us about their own important projects and what they have learned as we look back over this past year at the COVID experience. But more importantly, we want to spend most of our time looking forward at what is ahead and what are the critical issues that we must address in 2021. The COVID Cancer Consortium of 127 cancer centers has compiled data and produced an impressive array of scientific publications, abstracts, presentations, and articles in the lay press that deal with subjects ranging from COVID-19 treatments in cancer patients, the impact of convalescent plasma on survival, and the clinical features and anti-cancer therapies that are related to COVID severity. I believe the extensive nature of these contributions underscores the need to understand the impact of SARS-CoV-2 and the infection in the setting of a vulnerable population like cancer patients whose immune system and metabolic status may be compromised. So that gives us insights into an even larger population at risk. But there's an even bigger story here. On one hand, we may view the cancer patient as more vulnerable to the devastating impact of a COVID infection. But ironically, it is the cancer enterprise that is most equipped and effective to discover and unravel the biologic mysteries of this pandemic. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the National Cancer Act, which empowered the National Cancer Institute to create over these past 50 years an unequaled impressive infrastructure of cancer centers, biorepositories, data registries, and a host of resources that enable the rapid and extensive acquisition, aggregation, and analysis of data. The COVID-19 Cancer Consortium utilized these resources to understand the impact of SARS-CoV-2 in the infection in the setting of a cancer diagnosis. And our panelists have been at the forefront of some of that work. So let's begin to discuss what we have learned over the past year. And I'd like to ask each of them to just give us their top line soundbite of what did you learn or what surprised you looking back over this experience. And then after we go around very quickly to hear their insight, I want to come back to each of them and ask them to go deeper into their own initiative and share with us how they established registries and carried out the utilization of real-world data so that we all can learn and continue to improve. And after we've learned about their successes, we'll then have that conversation about the future. We'll begin with Dr. Gilberto de Lima Lopes. Dr. Lopes.
Thank you, Andrew. So the most important thing that we learned this year at CCC19 is the power of a grassroots movement, starting with the medical oncologists concerned about what to do for our patients and to understand what the implications of COVID-19 were for those patients.
Dr. Whisenant, how about you? What was your top line?
So I think what I learned, I'm not a physician, I'm a researcher, but I've learned a lot working with clinicians on this project and learning, especially with TerraVolt focusing on lung cancer malignancies or thoracic malignancies. COVID-19 symptoms are very similar. So us distinguishing between them has been difficult, and I think TerraVolt brought that to light, and especially put that these types of cancer patients are at increased risk of mortality.
Dr. Peters, top line.
Thank you. I had the opportunity to work with CCC19 and the ESMO registry, which is called ESMO Co-Care, which is still collecting data, trying to be also covering Asia, which is a very different environment, very diverse environment. Maybe 4 words I would use to qualify the efforts. First of all, like Gilberto was telling, I think the collaborative effort has been amazing. So we have been learning that collaboration goes above everything. Once it's about such a health problem, I would say damaging what we do and everything we have been doing for our patients. The second thing is I would say diversity, and we have been meeting probably most in ESMO co-care than in other registries, the regulatory difficulties, right? And even with COVID, activating a registry across various European countries is a nightmare. And I'm sure Jennifer can speak about it because they had the same problem in Terravot. So something I would say is prioritize. We start to learn that prioritizing patients, and particularly our patients and the fragile, the vulnerable, is a new wording we should repeat and repeat and repeat. The last thing is improvement. We have been doing very rapidly registries, very fast, but we could have gone better. If we had collected data from the very beginning, we would have known that some compounds are useless from the beginning, just by collecting data altogether. So I think there's a room for improvement in everything we have been doing for the next phases of COVID, and I hope they will stop very soon, but also in case such a disaster happens again internationally.
Well, I'm sure we'll touch on some of those important lessons learned as to how we do it better going forward, because COVID-19 is not going away in 2021 at this point. So Dr. Garrett-Mayer, what was your top line?
Yeah, so I think some of them might have been already highlighted, but the thing that really sticks out for me from what we've learned from our registry is the major changes that we've seen in the prognosis for patients with cancer who have gotten COVID. So early in the pandemic, the risks seemed to be very great for very severe outcomes, very serious outcomes, including death. And it's pretty shocking how the cancer care community was able to respond, share information, and learn from the early cases. And now the prognosis has improved dramatically from what we see in our data.
Yeah, I'll ask you to continue on with our roundtable discussion of, tell us about your registry, what some of the problems were that you encountered, how you solved those, what lessons you learned to go forward, and how you constructed it in a way to get the most optimal kind of outcomes.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So from the very beginning, we were very much focused on trying to understand changes to care, such as delays, discontinuations of aspects of care, and their effects on patients. So unlike some of the other registries, ours is practice-based, and so we enter into agreements with the practices to provide us their data, and they're essentially all in the medical oncology setting, although we do collect data on radiation treatments and surgeries. And our eligibility criteria includes primarily patients with active cancer. So that's a patient population in which there's a real concern regarding delays to treatment. So our focus was to collect information to answer questions surrounding modifications to care that would minimize impact on patient outcomes. And what we found, we tried to keep things simple, but very early on in interacting with our steering group, we realized we needed to be a lot more granular about the kinds of information we were collecting on treatment. So that was one thing that we pivoted on. It wasn't going to be good enough to find out if somebody had been receiving chemotherapy. We really needed to know what kind of chemotherapy, when did they start it, when did they stop it, et cetera. Some of the other things that we learned during inspection of the data early on, we had sort of thought that patients would come into practices and rapidly those patients' data would be entered into the database. What we found was really that there was more of a retrospective or batched entry, and really it was more data that was just pulled out of the EHR. So moving forward, after we had initially established it, we made updates to the registry to reflect it more as a real world data. So we sort of think of it as real world data that's highly curated because of the way that it's abstracted from the data set. So we did make a number of changes, just understanding from sort of the process of the way the data is collected, the best way to ask the questions and knowing who was entering the data. We couldn't ask things like necessarily, why did the physician change the plan? Because that's not necessarily going to be available, 3 months after a patient's diagnosed in the chart.
Thank you for that. Jennifer, how about from your perspective?
So similar to CCC19, Terravot sort of started because of an email chain between the thoracic oncologist over the weekend, and there was an urgent need to develop this database. And so we put something together. We met several times and to try and put together a comprehensive database at the time we felt would be really helpful in determining prognosis, what's happening to these patients, how can we better treat cancer, thoracic cancer patients that become positive with COVID-19. And so I think what I've learned definitely is database management and creation is complicated, and I have more sympathy for the people that make databases as a living, because given you're capturing real world data, it's so important to think about how a person entering it will think, whether that's a data manager, research nurse, or even a clinician, and they'll all answer it different ways. And we have a lot of free text in Theravolt, which at the time we thought was great, but that makes analysis challenging. And Solange touched on this as well, but Theravolt is an international registry, and given the privacy issues and privacy laws are different across different countries. And so we've had to work diligently and try to make sure that our one database covers a bunch of different confidentiality laws. So it's been an interesting experience, but I think our database, and same with CCC19, it can be changed very easily. And so I think as we've gone through this pandemic, we've learned what other questions we need to ask and been able to update the database accordingly.
Fantastic. Thank you. Gilberto, from your perspective.
I think we can't underscore enough how important both social media and crowdsourcing were in this process. So for us, it all started with a tweet mid-March by one of our founding members, was then a resident. And that really started a conversation that over a few days helped us set up the consortium that now has more than 100 participating centers in the country, in Spain and North America and Canada as well. And crowdsourcing truly helped us gather those data points that we should include in the survey in a manner that was much faster and much more comprehensive than it would have been for any one person to actually do it. So I think that those are the two most important things that we'd like to underscore: how social media truly helped us get together and start something quickly, and how crowdsourcing helped us make those data elements be put together in a way that is a lot more comprehensive than any one of us could have done. Of course, we did have issues in terms of privacy, in terms of getting IRB approval, and we did have a lot of support from one of our founding members' home institution. Their IRB and their legal team was really always available to help us as soon as possible, and that truly make things work a lot faster than they usually had. And I think that the importance and the relevance of the pandemic as a whole really showed us that if you really need these data and you really need to get the registry done, we can make it happen. And hopefully in the future, that's going to make us revamp not just registry studies, but also how we do clinical trials, because that's the other thing that we learned this year, that we can do things in a way that is more practical than what we had been doing. So I hope we really don't go back to doing things as they were. I hope that the pandemic will help us do things better in the future.
Yeah, there you go. Better in the future. Solange, what about from your perspective? Was the European experience comparable, or those things about your experience that were particularly unique? Did we lose Solange?
I'm on mute, sorry. Happens always.
There you are.
I had the opportunity to be involved in CCC19, Theravolt, and ESMO co-care, so I could a little compare. What I would say, the common and joint, I would say, event that characterizes this initiative is we had to deep dive fast in real-world data. It's a major topic, real-world data, right? I meet the regulatory authorities, being FDA or EMA, very often to know how can real-world evidence, real-world data be used. And with COVID, suddenly we had no choice. We had to use, build, create, malax, change real-world data, because that's all we had. So first of all, my experience is sometimes difficulties to collect, to anonymize. When I say difficulties to collect in Europe, is that remember that each patient in Europe, based on the general data protection regulation, needs to consent. So it means you have your COVID patient in the intensive care. You want to have it in the database, it has to consent. So, you know, all these kinds of barriers looks even I would say ridiculous or inadequate, but they define the data protection in all European countries, for example. So first, these barriers, which we will try to change in the future because we need to think about them again, but they're important. The second thing, real world data is giving you evidences. For example, TerraVolt was showing 30% mortality in lung cancer patients with COVID. When I came to my center, I said, well, that's not the case in my center. Yes, it's the case in my center, 30% mortality in the very rich Switzerland environment. So it means they give you strong, I would say, landmark data. But we have to work with caution about all the granularity of multi-adjusted data beyond, right? What treatment, what to change in our practice. Also a little bit of modest behavior in how you use this real-world data to potentially adjust your therapeutic intervention. And I think here TerraVolt, CCC19 have really shown us that the usual suspects, the ones we were fearing in the beginning, IO, you know, cytokine storm and so on, all the kind of suspicions we had did not get true at the end. So we need to be careful about real-world data helping you, but we need to adjust and take them with caution, diligently help you in making decisions, but not always.
Yeah, thank you. You know, for the group, we, you know, real-world data coming from these impressive registries is both a blessing and a curse. And on the blessing side, we have an enormous amount of data that we can have access to, and that can sometimes be the curse. So tell us a little bit about your experience about sorting through the various sources of data and how you utilize those, whether it's claims data or medical records or patient-reported outcomes. And in this avalanche of data, how do you decide which elements are the most important and which ones you do not need to burden the system with, and how does that work for all of you? Who'd like to pick that up?
So I can start with that. So we were pretty deliberate, thank you, from the beginning about understanding what would be available in EHRs. So at ASCO, we have the CancerLink database. And I'm sorry, did I interrupt you, Dr. Von Eschenbach?
No.
Okay.
Go ahead.
And so we had a pretty good understanding of the things that would be available and easy to pull out of charts. So for example, we thought about concomitant medications, but then we realized that not only would they be hard to pull out, but in an oncology practice, it's going to be an incomplete list. We really wouldn't, even if we tried to pull that data in, it would be incomplete. So we deliberately did not even ask those questions because we had a feeling that at the end of the day, it could end up leading to more biased methodologies by using them than by just not even including it. So we were very focused on the kinds of things that would be regularly included at patient visits at their visits to their oncologist. Another deliberate decision that we made was to include primarily active cancer patients, ones that would be going to and interacting with their oncology care team regularly. So we do include patients who are cancer-free within the last 12 months, but on adjuvant and anti-cancer adjuvant therapy, because we felt that they would also be visiting their oncologist. So we wanted to not only have patients that we would get a nice amount of data at the time it was known they had COVID and cancer, but that we could follow up with. So our registry, we currently are following patients approximately every 3 months through 12 months to get their follow-ups for both cancer and COVID. And we're talking now about extending that follow-up maybe to 24 months.
So you kind of started with, let's decide what our best data would be, and then we'll build from there. What about others? How did you come at this? How did you make these decisions, and what was most utilitarian for you?
I can go next if nobody, no, all right, there we go. So for us, it was a matter of deciding what it is that we could do as a community of medical oncologists, of practices, of institutions. And we took an approach that is a little bit more specific. We created a Redcap survey, and that survey too was ready within 48 hours or so of the inception of the group. And of course, that is not everything that makes it sound very easy, but once you do start gathering this amount of data, and we have data now on more than 8,000, almost 9,000 patients. You have to make sure about how rigorously these data were in, what you're missing, what is really reliable or not. So we did create systems and processes, starting with the steering committee and then with subcommittees and task force that did really help us organize and go through the data so that we could make sure that we could vouch for its accuracy and that the conclusions of what we're reporting would be able to be applied into decision-making in the clinic as well. So I think that that was maybe the most interesting thing about data gathering and sifting through to make sure that what we had was reliable.
So if I can interpret that a little bit, Gilberto, was a little bit more utilitarian, like what can we gather? And then from that, really start to discipline that with regard to, of that, what is most reliable.
Correct.
or
what is the information that we needed and could be gathered. So what types of diseases our patients had, what treatments they were getting, and everything that could be gathered by a clinician or a representative looking into patients' charts in each institution.
Yeah, thank you.
There is here a kind of a reality check, right? Because by building also Redcap of ESMO-CoCare, which is slightly larger than CCC19, but we have the same dictionary in order to be able to fuse everything at the end. Of course, you'd like to collect a maximal number of data which affect the outcome of any patients because you consider this might impact your final results. However, the reality tells you that there is a kind of a maximal content that you can really cover comprehensively and adequately across centers. Particularly think about lab tests, right? We all would like to be able to combine an analysis of cytokine storm, cytokine environment, the granularity of T-cell components in regard to mortality in the COVID situation. However, you also have to face real-world data. What was collected because it was considered to be useful in each center at each time point. So I think at the end you end up with sufficient data, again, because it's very important to do the adjustments which are needed to be able to bridge one parameter to the outcome. But of course, you will never be comprehensive enough to make sure that you do not miss some of the complexities of cancer patients' scenarios, right? And for example, in TerraVault, we've been seeing some treatment-related outcomes, which to me potentially correspond more to the scenario of a cancer patient, which cannot be described by one parameter, but really a conjunction of them. And this type of errors could only be corrected with 1,000 or 2,000 parameters. But of course, again, real-world data will never give you access to everything you need.
So if I interpret that again, to play it back, you started with basically a template first, and then continued to refine that as it was growing and evolving, and directed it to specific questions or issues.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Correct. And the surveys have been built in such a way that you can actually go back and forth as new information comes along.
So it's a dynamic growing process that you continue to refine. So this kind of leads us to the idea that you start out with a broad registry that captures the universe as much as possible, and then continue to distill that into well-defined cohorts that are rich enough in data where they can become directed towards specific questions, or from which you can draw hypotheses. Is that a fair assessment of how the process has unfolded over this past year?
Absolutely.
Generally for all of it?
Yes.
Yeah. That was true of you too, Jennifer, as far as how your experience evolved?
Oh, yes, yes, for sure.
So let me press you on that then a little bit further. Once we get to that point, you know, the problem that I have is this issue of, so where do we draw the line between associations and beginning to define causality? When does the data become rich enough that we have a threshold of assurance or certainty that upon which we can make decisions? We can begin to utilize that data in a way that it has a value proposition. For one example, when can we make regulatory decisions on real world evidence? So how do you come to those decisions once you've gathered all this data? When does it become actionable?
I can speak on the European level. You cannot make any regulatory decision on real-world data. That's the decision at the time being of the European Medicines Agency. The problem is, again, when you have real-world data, you might never be able to question everything you would like to question. And the quality of real-world data, how it was established, how it can be checked, verified afterwards, is always something which will question the conclusions brought by real-world data. So before using them, we should have a set of criteria which make them reproducible, to be verified, checked, and adequately taken into consideration. Of course, COVID didn't let us the choice, because that's all we had. But I would say, in terms of moving beyond COVID, we might use this opportunity to try to define what we expect from real-world data. Should it be global? Should it be covering the diversity of our institutions? Should it be, all of these questions have still not been defined in terms of real-world data collection. And that's really something which we might start to invent at the end of the COVID. I think for the COVID, the most important factor was to be able to, again, correct and adjust to the parameters we know affect the outcome of our patients, in order to be able to discriminate if one new factor can bring something to the field of COVID severity. But again, I think it was because we didn't have any other option. Real-world data have their limitation, and we need to acknowledge that.
How about the rest of you? Would you agree that we're not at a point in real-world data being acquired, aggregated, and analyzed to real-world evidence that we can make decisions like regulatory decisions or even clinical decisions?
I agree with Solange that for regulatory decisions, it is not in the realm of possibilities for real-world data to really show us that something works. We really truly need to randomize. And having said that, to show causality, you also need more of an experimental design. So we can show associations, we can show that something is correlated with something else, and we can make inferences from there that might have clinical implications. So I think that for us, the most important data, for instance, that has been validated independently in TheraVault and CCC19 is the high mortality of patients with lung cancer, for instance. With CCC19 and other registries, we also see the relationship of receiving anti-CD20 medications and a higher mortality as well. So once you start seeing repetitive stories and patterns in different databases that have different patients and were collected by different teams, I think then you can start making inferences that something will be important or relevant enough that we can use that for clinical decision making. And that's the power of having so many of these initiatives happening at the same time, because you independently collect and then you increase the validity of the findings a little bit more as well.
So if I heard that correctly, and I want the other panelists to play into this, there is a threshold at which real-world evidence is able to be utilized for clinical decisions, may not quite yet be to the point where you want to make regulatory decisions about it. But is it because it hasn't matured yet to that point? We don't quite yet have the methodologies and the analytics? Or do you think that that is in fact a distinction that will never change, that it will never get to that threshold? What's the other, all of you, have you a point of view as to, with all this incredible effort, what are the limits of its utility?
Yeah, so my perspective on this as a biostatistician is, you think of the randomized trial as sort of the gold standard. And then backing away from that, I would think of a well-designed cohort study or case control study. And in those cases, you actually have case report forms where you're collecting information. Now, granted, it's observational, so we can't rely on the things that we learn from randomized trials. But we know even in epidemiologic studies that there are problems in terms of unmeasured confounders and things that make it so our inferences can't be as robust as they would in randomized trials. So when I started working with real world data coming out of, for example, EHRs, I thought it was going to be very similar to the epidemiologic studies that I was used to working with. Turns out that's really still one step back, because you don't have the same, the rigorous data collection that you would, where you have consistency of data collection in for example, those exposed and those not exposed. So what that means from my perspective is, I think Dr. Peters has done a really nice job of talking about all the things we can't get from EHR data. The things that we can't get, a lot of times the reasons we can't get them is because they're related to the outcome we care about. So in statistical terms, we call that informative missingness. The reason something is missing is actually part of the causal pathway of the outcome. And so as a biostatistician, it's sort of my job to be kind of a downer in these things. So to be honest, I don't know that real world data is really going to get there because of, until we get to a point that the way it's collected is more rigorous and less biased. But even in that case, you know, if the reasons that physicians are making decisions about patient care, not every single piece of it is collected in the EHR, and we know it's not, we will never get them to be, you know, as good as randomized trials. So in sum, what I would say is I think of real world evidence and epidemiologic studies as complementary, but not able to be on their own, able to lead to regulatory decision making.
Jennifer, you agree with all that?
Yeah, I agree. And you could
There you go.
almost think about real world data as being the preliminary data needed that you need for designing a clinical trial. So I know there's a UK database effort very similar to all of ours that looked at longitudinal laboratory values, and because they found at different time points, they found certain lab values to be associated with severity and mortality. Now they are planning a randomized clinical trial specifically looking at those lab values. And if they hadn't collected this real world data, they may not have known what lab values to collect, or they would have done a whole bunch of different panels that may just have muddied the waters. So I think we could look at this as our preclinical data needed for a more targeted assessment in a rigorous clinical trial design.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let me press you all a little bit further on that. We're going to talk about, you know, the future as we've been looking back at the past, and the real, you know, the prospective randomized trial has been our gold standard of the past. If we look ahead at the future and we realize our ability to acquire this data is increasingly becoming more and more sophisticated, you're all putting together infrastructure that's done an amazing job of aggregating these data elements across various sources. And we can perhaps look ahead at increasingly more sophisticated methodologies for analytics that separate signal from noise, and maybe even begin to think about abstract concepts like, you know, artificial intelligence, machine learning, et cetera, et cetera. Can you envision the future where we do get to a level of comfort and certainty that we seem to ascribe to the prospective randomized trial, knowing they're not perfect and we miss things in randomized trials that we don't even know about until we get into the real world? So what about looking forward? Do you see pathways to be explored, not to be utilized today necessarily, but where are we going with, and why should we continue to put all this effort into registries and consortia and methodologies for analytics?
Maybe I can start. I see two options. First of all, and maybe short term, is to try to homogenize the definition we have of real world data. So it means what are the minimal set of criteria we consider we would be using to consider real world data in order to build the hypothesis for a future randomized trial would be one usage. But the other one, and we all know as oncologists, is to represent the standard arm of a rare disease entity, for example. So probably criteria, which will be slightly different in the stringency of the criteria, but we need to first of all try to define what we would be as scientific investigators, maybe not as regulators, but what we would be satisfied with. Yes. The long-term idea is, to me, artificial intelligence, the implementation of homogenized system where the data grabbing, the data collection, the data mining will be inherent to the system you use, because we all would collect the same data at the same time points with the same definitions. is probably the way in the future to have immediately the data you need across centers and countries. This is also, remember, the system implement guidelines, so you're supposed to follow even the same path in the treatment strategy, or at least grossly the same path. So, but it will take 5, 10, 50, 20 years, I don't know, until this intelligent AI kind of systems will be implemented. But for example, in ESMO, I'm already been approached by 4 systems to try to implement ESMO guidelines. So it's at the door, right? And this might be the way to reduce, I would say, this inhomogeneity, this low quality that might still characterize real-world data at the time being. So I strongly believe in that.
Thank you for that, Solange. Others?
I can go next if is that okay? Sure. So in the short term, I think that the main applications for real-world data are for us to validate the data that we have seen in a randomized fashion in a clinical trial about what has efficacy and what's effective. It will be much better and much more automated ways for us to see if those results that were obtained in a very specific, very controlled population in a clinical trial can truly be extrapolated for a larger population of patients with that disease or not. And I think that this is where the methods will probably become more useful first, as well as probably in pharmacovigilance. I think that we do a relatively poor job today at pharmacovigilance, and we could do a lot better with automated systems that look into AI and actually extract data automatically from large data sets. In the future, I do agree with Solange. I think that AI may help us identify patterns and correlations that we wouldn't maybe even create hypotheses for. So I think that there's a role in the volume of data and how specific and how creative and how precise we become in being able to analyze these large data sets as well, so that you can, as you said, remove the noise and try to see what's really true information. But in terms of truly being able to do this as a way of approving medications, it may work for very specific situations. Let's say you have a disease that a specific mutation is rare and we have an inhibitor that can block that. You might be able, but again, you will need to create that system as a study so that you can give a medication that's not approved. So I really don't see, at least in the short and midterm, that these would become a way of using for regulatory approval of medications.
So I'll jump in with my perspective on this, different than the others. Maybe oddly, as a methodologist, not going towards AI, but really going more towards patient-focused information. So, you know, we rely to some extent in many areas on performance status, and we really don't have a good measure for it. I feel like in these registries, if we had a validated measure of patient health and wellness, you know, at COVID diagnosis, prior to COVID diagnosis, throughout COVID, we would be so much better off. And I know from our own perspective, I think we have missing data on ECOG in at least 50% of reports, if not more. But ECOG performance status still isn't very good on its own. So, you know, there have been talks among many different people about coming up with sort of a frailty index specific to oncology patients that would incorporate, you know, all of these, you know, different comorbidities and things like that. So it is a little bit maybe sort of towards the AI, but really more from, I think, traditional sort of scale development perspective. And then the other thing is patient-reported outcomes. We would love to be able to collect information on these long-lasting symptoms of COVID, but the problem is thinking into the EHR, what is really going to be recorded in an oncologist's EHR about things that are well known about COVID. Maybe in some patients' charts they might be there, and in others not. So this issue of you know, the missingness is a real problem. But if we had things that we said every time the patient comes in, we're going to collect, you know, this measure of patient wellness, patient health, this index, I think that would help us tremendously without necessarily needing every single piece to be included or utilized in our analytics.
Jennifer, any thoughts?
So it's an interesting idea that Dr. Garrett-Mayer just mentioned. I was going to echo the others by saying there's machine learning algorithms that have become very, very smart and very exquisite, and the more data you feed it, the smarter they get. So real world data could help us in that respect, feeding this data in, it would be crucial that all the data is collected in a robust way, which could be very complicated, especially with surveys, especially with patient-reported outcomes as well. And I know from a lung cancer perspective, some of these long-term sequelae could just be cancer-related, not just COVID-related. So defining the difference between those could be tricky. But I do think machine learning would have a role, and I think that's something that we could consider. I'm working on as an off topic, but on another project where we are using machine learning for palliative cancer care model, and so they're using real world data and building a model and validating it. So I think it can have a role here.
Well, you know what you're setting the stage for is really the conversation that's critical at this point, like what's ahead in 2021. And I think Dr. Pergrin really laid a number of important issues of unanswered questions that are still needing attention. Clearly, this virus has got an intricate relationship with the immune system, and that allows the cancer scenario to be an important source of insight and information. And then we have this whole issue of what we call long hauler, or now is long COVID. It's the post-viral syndrome, and specifically how that's going to impact cancer patients who are living with the consequences of their disease, both the disease itself and the treatment. So looking ahead to 2021, using the resources and gathering those who are listening in together in this joint effort, where do you see the opportunities, the important questions we need to hone in on and focus in on so that we collectively as a community over the next 6 to 9 to 12 months really develop deeper insights, create new hypotheses, and really advance our understanding not only of COVID in the cancer patient, but COVID in the population? Thoughts about your future plans?
Yeah, so alongside commemorating the 1 year of work that we have done together with CCC19, the whole idea of this scientific retreat is exactly that, for us to discuss what is it that we don't know yet, what are the things that we should start adapting the surveys and other methods to be able to address moving forward. We've had a basic discussion. I would love to hear the other panelists on that as well, but looking into long haulers as discussed, looking into the impact of vaccines in terms of side effects in patients with cancer or patients on immunotherapy, and most importantly, how effective it is in preventing severe cases of COVID-19 in patients living with cancer. I think that those are the most important unanswered questions that we hope to be able to address with some of our surveys and registries. But I'll let everybody come forward and let us know what they're hoping for.
I would agree. I think vaccine, right? We need to, first of all, acknowledge the fact that our patients have to be prioritized, not related to the well-known activity of the vaccine, but the well-known mortality of the COVID, right? Second, we need to acknowledge the fact that we need to diligently collect all this data. And the third thing, we need to inform, because I don't know about your countries, but I'm still living in a country where there is a kind of a homogeneous fear of the vaccine, even among our patients. So we need to inform. And once everything is done in our countries, and here I take my political hat, I'm extremely concerned about how the vaccine will be distributed, right? And how we will see that again and again, what we hate in our world is this diversity, these discrepancies, this unfairness sometimes will again affect the same people in the future. And this fifth, sixth wave might not happen everywhere, but they might happen where we expect it to happen again.
Liz, what are your plans?
So
Jennifer, either one?
Go ahead, Liz.
Okay, sorry. So one of the things from the keynote that struck me was the notion that, we're sort of thinking of, things get, I think our optimism says things like, this is getting wrapped up, we're getting a handle on it. But as was clearly noted, cancer patients are still going to be getting COVID. It's still going to be a thing that has to be dealt with. So I look forward to the registries now that they're much more mature and have longer term information. I think in particular from the ASCO registry, we're looking a lot at delays and discontinuations. How much impact is that really having on patient outcomes? Can you delay somebody's treatment a cycle or two because of the intervening COVID or not? What happens if you just continue on? And I think that not only will be able to answer those questions and help the care of COVID. I mean, it's broader, right? Infectious disease of other kinds happens, right? And it intervenes in cancer care. So I think that some of the questions that we can answer, what we'll be looking to answer, are going to be much broader than just the context of COVID-19. That's what I'm hoping.
From a terrible perspective, we are starting to think about, in our survivors, what are some of the other questions that we could add to the database to get at, the long-term effects of the disease and delays in cancer treatment. Exactly. We have a couple questions about that, but it's not real mature. And so I think we're starting to think about what can we ask? What are the right questions to ask so that we can address that concern? And I think we are going to add the vaccine information. I think it's very interesting to see, if a patient gets the vaccine, do they still become positive? And what happens to the symptoms? Are they asymptomatic? Or are they not? Do they have severe? And so I think these databases can be a way to pivot. Now, if we start thinking about it, we can pivot these databases from the initial acute mortality issue to more long-term effects of the disease and the vaccine, and to get information that would help Solange's concern regarding her political hat. Like, can we provide some help to these cancer patients who are hesitant to get the vaccine?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I think you're so amazingly well positioned and equipped, and we all should be extremely grateful for this cancer COVID consortium, is, our oncology model has always been that the outcome of a cancer is the product of the seed and the soil. It's the properties of the cancer cell, all of its features, genetically, molecularly, et cetera. But it's also the soil that it finds itself in, the patient, microenvironment and macroenvironment. And that storyline is playing out exceedingly here in the COVID experience. I mean, clearly the virus is changing, and a virus has its own unique characteristics and features, receptor binding, et cetera, but it's also the host that it finds itself in. And clearly this is proving to be an extraordinarily heterogeneous expression of an infection, just as cancer is extraordinarily heterogeneous. So looking forward at being able to continue and expand this work, I think not only serves the cancer patient, it's going to serve our understanding of especially post-viral syndrome or post-long COVID, because that is emerging in a frightening frequency. So your ability to continue to coalesce around these critical questions will be an extraordinary contribution. So with that in mind, clearly not everything has worked well or perfectly or could not be improved upon. So looking ahead for a round robin final question before we close, if you had the magic wand, I gave you all the resources or whatever, what would you change? What would you fix? What would you do differently going forward? What would your wish list be of, I'd like it to be this or that as we look ahead at 2021? What's your wish list? And we'll start with you, Jennifer. I'll give you the magic wand. What would you change? What would you do better? What would you add? What would you fix?
I think if we had had more time to develop the initial survey, we could have thought more about who's entering the data and what type of perspective they're coming with, because data analysis for Terraville has been very tricky. I have spent hours cleaning this data. And so I think the way you develop a survey is very important, and the way you ask the questions are very important. And know that there's different people putting in these data, and so you've got to be rigorous at even how you answer the question, how you ask the question.
So you'd reinforce the discipline on the front end and
Yes.
provide more rigor to that and more resources to train and to develop and implement that rigor. Great, thank you. Gilberto, what would you change? What would you do differently? What would
I
you
wish
improve?
we had emergency funds for this type of research. We really had to do all this with internal fund or no funding at all. So having ways of obtaining really quick funding for emergency issues like COVID-19 would have been ideal.
Yeah. So making the case for that, and look, $1 billion plus is theoretically supposed to go to NIH now for long haul or post-COVID and whatever. So making the case that this effort really needs to be a part of that larger strategy and resourced appropriately and accordingly.
Absolutely.
Good. We should gather around that rally flag and go from there. How about you, Liz? What would you do differently?
If I could do something differently, with unlimited resources, I'd have patient consent. So we would have less missing information and could get more detailed data about why certain decisions might have been made by physicians and how patient wellness was in a more long-term setting, 6, 9, 12 months after COVID. What were the symptoms they were feeling? What were the changes in their quality of life? What kind of tasks of daily living were they not able to continue to do?
Yeah, can we utilize the cancer centers maybe a little bit more in the messaging to patients how critically important their data is, their experience is, and to give permission for that at the outset so that once we get the infrastructure matured, we're getting people to participate. So that may be a goal and objective for the consortium to, in addition to the resources, is to get the moral, cultural support of getting patients to understand and acquiesce. So Ange, what's your vision for how you would make it better?
Well, the database related, I would say, priorities have been stressed by my colleagues. I think one of the aspects we have not, and it's probably beyond this registries, but the supportive part of what we could provide for physicians, for the health system, and for patients. Thinking, for example, about the collection of patient-related outcomes, for example, has been quite poor. We have been trying to collect scientific data in order to understand, anticipate, prepare, design, but we haven't been treating so much the problems of the impact of all the decisions we were taking time after time. On the personal, right, on the professionals, for example, and we've been seeing for the first time this series of burnouts, but also for the patients. So something about trying to go a little deeper in how we can support a system which makes its best to collect, to anticipate and prepare would be, and just thinking as a starting point for database, patient-related outcomes or even physicians-related outcomes, right, would be something that we should see more the next time, because what will make the third wave difficult is, of course, COVID. But the very difficult part of it is how everyone around is exhausted.
So you see this as an opportunity for continuous quality improvement by learning, adapting, but learning again and adapting again.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, and maybe get prepared, right, with a certain degree of resilience. We were not prepared, and we would probably have another system in place if we had to anticipate a second COVID kind of pandemic, right? Yeah.
Well, let me end by saying congratulations to all of you and to the consortium as a whole. People are asking, what has changed because of COVID, and what do we need to retain, and what can't we let go away or go back to? And I think we can't go back to a real world data, real world evidence opportunity based on registries. Your efforts have created a foundation. We need to not see that foundation erode, but actually be strengthened and built upon as we go forward. So thank you for making that future possible. And we'll hopefully come back again in a year to recount the next level of progress. And with that, I'll turn it back over to our sponsors and appreciate our panel. And I think we give you all a virtual round of applause.
I'll give you a round.